Good morning. Pansy the Answer Dog and I are going to do a second part of the skeletal muscular system focusing on muscles, quiz 7, and come up with a novel approach here. We're going to split this remaining portion of the PowerPoint into two sections. There'll be a part 2, which we're going to do now, and then there'll be a part 3. Part 3 is going to feature the specific muscles that we're going to be responsible for. But anyway, let's go with part 2. Pansy's pretty excited. She already had her breakfast and she's all ready to help out. So, a motor unit. Motor units are the cells, muscle cells that are innervated by one nerve and or neuron. And neurons can innervate varying numbers of cells depending upon how strong the muscle is. So very strong muscles, powerful muscles, such as the muscles in the leg or in the thigh, might have 1,000 cells per neuron, whereas a motor unit for a muscle that has fine movement, not a lot of power, such as muscles that move the eye, might have as few as 20 or 25 or 23 cells per neuron. So that varying differences on how many cells per neuron based and related to the strength of the muscle contraction. So the all or none law applies to the motor unit, and what that means is that when a neuron stimulates those muscle cells, there's always enough stimulus to cause all of the cells to contract. So there's no varying amount of stimulation needed. It's always enough. And so because of that, all the cells are going to contract at the same time. If you cut the nerve or destroy the nerve that controls our motor unit, then the motor unit will no longer contract. This is, again, all skeletal muscles. Smooth muscles and cardiac muscles are able to self-excite or respond to hormones, but the skeletal muscles do not. If the muscle doesn't contract anymore, we get a condition called atrophy. And in atrophy, the mass of the muscle decreases. It starts to be replaced by connective tissue, the muscle cells, and then eventually it becomes fatty tissue. The stimulation of the muscle cell occurs at the synapse between the neuron, and the muscle cell itself. And there's a depression, like a cup-shaped depression, in the muscle cell that the axon terminal fits into. The neuron doesn't actually physically touch the muscle cell, and so then the obvious question is, well, if it doesn't touch, how does the action potential get conveyed from the neuron to the muscle cell? Nancy knows the answer. Right, neurotransmitters. Okay, so the synapse is the space between the cell, and neurotransmitter molecules, acetylcholine molecules, diffuse from the neuron to the muscle cell. These acetylcholine molecules are contained in vesicles within the neuron in the axon terminal. And when the neuron has an action potential, those vesicles move to the neuron cell membrane. They burst through exocytosis. The acetylcholine is released into the space, and then it diffuses, goes from high concentration to low. The high concentration is going to be at the neuron, and then the low concentration would be at the muscle cell. And the acetylcholine moves across that synapse and causes the cells to become excited. So here's a picture demonstrating what I just said. Here is the axon terminal. Here are these little vesicles within the axon terminal. They contain the acetylcholine. And then when the action potential arrives here, it causes these vesicles to move to the cell membrane to undergo exocytosis. And then the neurotransmitters diffuse across the space. Now remember, diffusion is random, so they don't just run over here. They kind of bounce around all over the place. But since it's a very short distance, they eventually, or most of the time, come in contact with these receptor sites. And the receptor sites will always get enough stimulation to cause the postsynaptic cell to have an action potential. So the obvious question is, where do these neurotransmitter molecules come from? Is this magic or something? Fancy knows. Right. The endoplasmic reticulum. So the endoplasmic reticulum is going to produce the neurotransmitters. the neurotransmitter molecules move to the Golgi complex, where they get packaged into vesicles, and then the vesicles are in the cell, in the neuron, and under the appropriate stimulation they release the neurotransmitter into the synapse. So then the question is, okay, if the neuron stimulates the muscle cells when they always contract, and they're always going to contract with exactly the same strength, how can we increase the strength of contraction? Because I'm sure you're all aware that when you have muscle contractions, you can make those contractions very strong or very weak. For example, if you were trying to pick up some very delicate thing on a table top, you wouldn't grab it with all the force that you have. You would do it very carefully and with very little contraction strength. But then if you had to lift up 100 pounds off the floor, you'd have to have contractions that would be very strong. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we can use to increase the strength of contraction is called recruitment. And in recruitment, more motor units get involved. The more motor units get involved, the stronger the contraction. Another way of increasing contraction strength is through summation. And in summation, what we do is rapidly stimulate the active cells. Instead of having single contractions, they start to run together because the relaxation phase isn't long enough for the cell to go back to a completely rested state. And because of that, the next contraction begins with the cell partially contracted already. That increases strength because there's going to be more there's more overlap between the actin and myosin filaments. And gradually, the more and more rapidly the cell is stimulated, the greater the strength, until eventually the cell goes into tetany. Now, at tetany, you get maximum strength, and that's a good thing. But the problem with tetany is that it means that the cells are not getting any relaxation time. And if you don't get any relaxation time, they're eventually going to fatigue. And generally, when you're using your muscles to do things, you don't want your muscle cells fatiguing. So how do we get around that? Well, we actually have a special way of stimulating these cells. It's called asynchronous stimulation of the motor units. And what that means is one motor unit will be active, but other motor units will be at rest. And when, after a little time has passed, one of the other resting motor units can be stimulated, and the one that was already active can relax. And so this is a little bit like a day and night shift at a factory. That's an analogy I kind of like to use. So while some motor units are resting, they're recovering. The other motor units are in tetany, giving maximum strength. This reduces the risk that the muscle will go into fatigue. And this is like having people coming in the first shift and working a certain number of hours, and then about the time they're going to go home, a second shift comes in and starts doing their work. And then that just keeps alternating back and forth, as opposed to having one shift come in and work until they completely drop of fatigue, and then hope you can find somebody else to take over for them. Okay, tone. Even when muscles are relaxed, some of the fibers are contracting, and tone helps maintain our posture so that you don't slump or fall over. So for example, the muscles of your neck and your trunk and your lower limbs, if they were to completely relax, you would collapse. You'd fall down. So we use a certain number of motor units all the time, maintaining a little bit of contraction strength to maintain our posture, keep us from falling down. Okay, what about athletics when we become active? Exercise is going to affect muscles, and size of muscles are obviously going to affect. So we already talked about atrophy a little bit. If you don't use muscles at all, they will atrophy. And remember, that means that the muscle mass decreases, connective tissue starts to replace the active cells, and then eventually fat replaces the normal other kinds of connective tissue. You can see this happen if somebody is in a cast for a broken bone. So if a person breaks their arm or breaks a forearm and they have a cast on and they can't move that appendage for a long period of time, when they take the cast off, that appendage will be smaller than the other side. So Adipose tissue and fibrous tissue replace the muscle cells. Another problem if muscles aren't used, for example, if somebody goes into a coma or something of that sort, sometimes you get what are called contractures, and the muscles shorten and then stay permanently shortened, and they won't be able to, or at least not easily, get stretched back out to their normal length. Hypertrophy. If people exercise, then their muscle size gets larger. Now, that doesn't mean you get new muscle cells. It just means the active cells become physically larger. And typically, if you're trying to build up muscle mass, you need to be active at 75% or more of the maximum capacity of the muscle. So, for example, let's say that your maximum, and this is just for our argument's sake, let's say that your maximum ability to flex your forearm would be with a load of 100 pounds. Let's say you couldn't lift any more than 100. 100 is your maximum value. If you want to make your muscles bigger and stronger, and you want to do exercises to do that, you're going to have to exercise at 75 pounds or more, trying to flex objects, 75 pounds or more force. And if you do that, and you keep doing that, over time, on a regular and frequent basis, your muscles get bigger. This is what people do when they go to the gym. One of the things you want to understand, though, is that this is sort of a moving target. So let's say that you start out and you can only flex with 100 pounds of force, and so you do over 75 pounds, and you keep doing reps, and you do this day after day, and your muscle strength gets greater and greater and greater. If you were, just to keep the math simple, if you were able to get up to 200 pounds of force, to further increase the muscle size, you're going to have to now be exercising at 150 pounds or more, because 75% of 200 is 150. So if you keep exercising at 75 pounds over time, the muscles will initially get bigger and stronger, but then eventually you'll just maintain the mass that you have achieved. So you increase the size and you increase the strength of the muscle mass through this activity. Also, another thing that changes within a muscle that's active is you increase the blood supply. Obviously, this is important because you need to get resources in for the cells so that they can contract and get waste products away from the cells. Another thing that happens if you train, let's say you're training for a marathon or something like that, you increase the number of mitochondria in each of the cells. This is very cool, and it goes both ways. If you were to stop exercising, then the number of mitochondria would decrease, the blood supply would decrease, and the size of the muscle would decrease. Some people like to push the envelope of what they can do with their muscles, and so they use steroids to increase their muscle mass. Honestly, there are huge numbers of risks that are incurred if you start using steroids to increase muscle mass. You really should avoid using steroids for this kind of outcome, because the outcome often is not very good. Okay. Sometimes we have muscle contractions and the cell actually does not shorten. And this is called an isometric contraction. And some of you have probably even heard of isometric exercises. So the reason the cell doesn't get any shorter is it's trying. You try to get it to shorten, but the force it's exerting is less than the resistance it's experiencing, so no movement occurs. Sometimes you have muscle contractions and the cell does shorten. This would be an isotonic contraction. And if the cell gets shorter, it's called a concentric contraction. So this is the kind of contraction you would have if you see movement of one of your appendages relative to the rest of your body. And this occurs because the force is greater than the resistance, so it overcomes the resistance. Okay, sometimes you try to contract your muscle, but it actually gets longer. And some of you are probably thinking, how could this be? This could be if you were trying to do push-ups, let's say. This is called an eccentric contraction, and in this case the resistance exceeds the strength of the muscle contraction. So if you are in the up position in a push-up, you've achieved that by extending your elbow. primarily use triceps brachii, and coneus helps out a little bit. But then when you're in the up position, if you want to go back down, you still contract your triceps brachii and your coneus, but the force of gravity is exerting more force on your body than those muscles, and so gradually your elbow flexes, and that's actually stretching those muscles, and that's an eccentric contraction. When muscles contract, the force that they exert is going to be parallel to the long axis of the cell. So, what do we use when we walk around? Typically, most muscle activity includes both isometric and isotonic. So let me give you an example. When you're walking, you flex your knee, pick your foot up off the ground, and then you extend your knee, and your foot goes back toward the ground. Obviously, things are going on at your hip as well. But I want to focus on the knee because that's where we see the isometric contraction. The isotonic contraction means that the knee moves, okay, and that happens. And then eventually your foot goes back to the ground. When your foot hits the ground, your knee will still be flexed a little bit. That acts as a shock absorber. But if you want to walk, what you typically do is then continue to extend your knee until it's locked. And when it's locked, the muscles that are causing the extension, primarily the quadriceps muscles, are going to stay contracted even though the knee is no longer moving. So there you've got contraction with no movement of the joint associated with the contraction, and that would be an isometric contraction. When you moved your joint, that would be an isotonic contraction. So we use both. Okay. There are going to be different kinds of muscle cells in terms of their attributes in contraction. There are slow twitch muscle cells and there are intermediate twitch muscle cells. Sometimes they're called slow twitch fibers or intermediate twitch fibers. And these two types tend to be aerobic. That is, they use oxygen and cell metabolism to get the ATP that they require in most conditions. And these can become anaerobic, but they usually run in an aerobic way. The slow twitch fibers are sometimes called type 1 fibers. Intermediate twitch fibers are sometimes called type 2A fibers. The slow twitch fibers are going to have small numbers of cells per motor unit. Okay. And the slow twitch fibers are best for endurance kinds of activities. So you would use these if you're running a marathon or doing a Ironman triathlon or that sort of thing. They do get tired eventually if you use more energy than they have available, but overall they resist fatigue. They have more mitochondria than most other cells, and that means that they can metabolize organic molecules more efficiently and quickly. They often have myoglobin in them. Myoglobin, I think we've maybe talked about this already, but globin sounds a little bit like hemoglobin, right? And hemoglobin is an oxygen-carrying molecule in red blood cells. The myoglobin is an oxygen-carrying molecule in muscle cells. And when there is more oxygen than is being used by the cell, the myoglobin forms bonds with the oxygen. And then when the oxygen starts to be depleted, the myoglobin can release the oxygen. Myoglobin is red, just as hemoglobin is, and that adds to the color of the cell. Slow twitch cells tend to have more blood supply serving them, which is beneficial, obviously, for endurance kinds of activity. This means the color of the tissue is going to be red, both because of myoglobin and because of the blood supply. And as I mentioned, these are going to be used in triathlons, especially long duration triathlons, long distance running, things of that nature. Long distance bicycle racing, like the fellows in the Tour de France or things like that. The intermediate twitch cells have many mitochondria also, and they have myoglobin also, and they also have an extensive blood supply. So in many ways, their situation is very similar to the slow twitch cells. They contract more quickly than the slow twitch cells, however, so you get a little bit more speed out of them. And these are used for walking and jogging and biking, things that aren't excessively endurance in nature but still need muscle contractions. The fast twitch cells are really quite different from the other two. They have fewer mitochondria, so that means they're going to be a little bit more difficult for them to create ATP, manufacture ATP. They frequently operate anaerobically, so they use fermentation, they use glycolysis to get their energy. And because they're running anaerobically, they tend to fatigue pretty quickly. Most of the ATP does come from glycolysis. They don't have very much myoglobin. For that reason, they're not particularly red. They usually have less blood supply. That also means that they're not particularly red. But they are very good when you need an explosion of energy. Like, for example, if you're serving a tennis ball and you need to generate a whole bunch of energy real quickly, or if you're throwing a baseball. But something that's not going to be carried on for long periods of time. The fast twitch cells are going to have more extensive sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is going to have two benefits. One is that when they do have an action potential, they can release a lot more calcium quickly, which is going to lead to a quicker response. And when they are all done with their action potential and they're recovering, it also means that they can remove the calcium more quickly and get it back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So both the contraction phase is faster and the relaxation phase is faster. These are used for rapid, short interval kind of activity, sprinting, hitting a golf ball, pitching baseballs, things of that nature. So whole muscles, which kind of muscle cell are they used, Pansy? Right, all three. Okay. And depending on, not all muscles have exactly the same mix in terms of percentages. Some have more of one or more of the other. Here's an interesting and very cool thing, though. Intermediate twitch cells can actually be trained to become slow twitch cells. But slow twitch cells can't be trained to become intermediate twitch cells. So if you're really doing marathons, let's say, those cells in your muscles that might have the capacity to go more rapidly can actually be sort of recruited into the slow twitch pool, making you better suited for the endurance activity. Okay, so I don't know how many of you have ever seen wild duck or wild goose served and a meal, but if you look at the pectoral muscles of wild flying birds, they have very red pectoral muscles, and this is because of the high percentage of slow twitch endurance kinds of muscle cells. Whereas if you look at the pectoral muscles of a domesticated turkey, which hardly ever flies, if ever. Wild turkeys do fly, but they don't fly a lot. They rely more on running around. But domesticated turkeys don't fly at all, pretty much. And their pectoral muscles are going to be white. And this is because their pectoral muscles have not got the myoglobin, the extensive blood supply, and they're more toward a fast twitch situation. Okay, so the duration of the contraction is going to be related to what the muscle normally does. So if you have a muscle that is normally undergoing relatively slow but long-term activity with a lot of power, they're going to be red muscles. And if you have a muscle that's relatively weak and better suited for short duration activity, that's going to be a white muscle. Okay, lever systems. Lever systems are an essential part of movement. And we have three kinds. We have first-class levers, second-class levers, and third-class levers. We'll look at all three. All levers are going to have three components. They're going to have a fulcrum as opposed to half of a crumb. They're going to have a force, and I hope that it will be with you. And then they have resistance. So the fulcrum is formed by our diarthroses. That's what our joints do. The force is either skeletal muscles or gravity, or it could be both skeletal muscles and gravity working together. The resistance can be a lot of different things. So we could have friction. For example, if you had a rock with a rope tied around it and you were dragging it across the floor, that would be resistance. Inertia. If a body is at rest, it tends to remain at rest. And so if you're standing still and you want to start to move, you have to overcome the inertia that you have. On the other hand, if you're running really quickly and then you decide you have to stop, and you use your muscles to stop, you're overcoming inertia there, because the body in motion tends to remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So the muscles would be that outside force. Attractive and imposing forces, there are lots of different ones there about magnets. So for example, if you get a really good grade on one of your exams, you might use a magnet to put it on your refrigerator, and if you want to remove it, you have to pull the magnet off the refrigerator. Gravity, now we use gravity sometimes to our benefit to create a force to make movement, but sometimes we oppose gravity. So when you pick your foot up off the ground, you're opposing gravity, or if you pick up an object up off the ground. And then opposing muscles. It's not uncommon to have muscles contracting at the same time that are opposing each other to sort of stabilize a joint. So here's the first class lever, and the characteristic that sets it apart is that the force and the resistance are on opposite sides of the fulcrum. This is what you would have if you used a crowbar to lift a rock. I do this all the time in my yard. And the way this is set up, we have a mechanical advantage, and the reason is that the rock is much closer to the fulcrum than the force. So if this rock were to weigh 100 pounds, you could probably lift it with about 30 pounds of force. That's a good deal. Here is a first class lever in our body. So here we have a student who is sitting in his or her chair, and they decide they want to lean forward with their head to look at what is on the desktop, or to fall asleep. And when their head goes this way, we have muscles like the trapezius muscle on the other side of the fulcrum that pulls it back. Okay. The fulcrum in this case would be the joint between the atlas and the occipital condyles. Okay. And you can see that this person could clearly smoke a cigar in the rain. Wow. That won't be on the quiz. Pansy's rolling her eyes. Here's a second class lever. Second class lever, the force and the resistance are on the same side of the fulcrum, but generally the force is going to be quite a bit further away from the fulcrum than the resistance. This is like a wheelbarrow. And this is also a mechanical advantage. Again, if this rock were to weigh 100 pounds, you could probably pick it up with somewhere around 30 or maybe 25 pounds of force. The longer the handle, the easier it is to pick up. Do we have them in our bodies? We do. So here is a second class lever. We've got the force being exerted by the gastrocnemius. The resistance is coming down through the leg, through the tibia and the fibula, and the fulcrum is at the ball of the foot. And you'll notice that this person has a wicked long foot and toenail. Oh my God, they need to trim that. Then here's the third class lever. In a third class lever, the fulcrum, the resistance and the force are on the same side of the fulcrum, just like a second class lever, except in this case, the resistance is further from the fulcrum than the force. And in this case, we have a mechanical disadvantage. And what that means is it's more difficult to do things with a third class lever than it is with a first or a second class lever. What is this, Pansy? It is not a chicken. Okay, this is a hand. We can tell it's a hand because of the thumb, right? Sometimes she is really difficult. Okay, so there's a force being created by a flexor of the forearm, let's say the biceps brachii. We have a couple of flexors of the forearm, but we'll use biceps brachii. Here's the resistance. That's a rock in the palm of the hand, and then the elbow is going to be the fulcrum. And there's a kind of a moral to this picture. Don't arm wrestle gorillas. So you might say, why? But remember, the third class levers are a disadvantage. And the closer the muscle attaches to the fulcrum, the more of a disadvantage it is. Gorillas have their muscles attached closer to their wrist. And because of that, if they had muscles exactly the same strength as a human muscle, they would be able to create more force on their forearm than a human. So they always win in arm wrestling. Just a point of note, point of information. If you see an arm wrestling contest between a gorilla and a human, and the gorilla knows what they're doing, bet on the gorilla. So most of the joints in our body are set up with third class levers, and most therefore at mechanically disadvantaged. So if you believe that evolution favors situations and configurations that are effective and beneficial, that it would suggest that since this is the hardest way to do things, there must be some benefit to having third-class levers as opposed to first or second. And there is, and the advantage is that they are faster. Okay, you get more power, more speed, not more power, more speed. The offsetting problem is that you lose power. It's always a trade-off. So if you increase speed, you lose power. If you increase power, you lose speed. A good example is something that you can probably relate to pretty easily would be pitchers and tennis players. So major league pitchers, the fastest fastball pitchers are pitching a little bit over 100 miles an hour, maybe 103 or 4 or 5 or 6 miles an hour, something like that. That's really extraordinary. The fastest tennis players can serve a tennis ball at 150 miles an hour. So how can the tennis players do that? They're extending their lever system. They're using a racket, and the head of the racket is traveling faster than their hand. And so when they hit the ball, it imparts more energy to the ball, and it goes faster. Okay. So we've got some basic principles that we need to kind of go through. We have origins and insertions. The origins and insertions typically refer to skeletal muscles, and the origin is usually proximal and usually does not move. The insertion is usually distal and it usually does move. So, giving an example, the biceps brachii. Biceps brachii's origin is in the shoulder. It has two origins actually. It has the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula and the the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and it has the coracoid process of the scapula. The insertion, it also has two insertions. They're going to be down the forearm. So it inserts on the radial or bicipital tuberosity of the radius, and it also inserts on the bicipital aponeurosis that goes to the medial side of your forearm. Usually when the biceps brachii contracts, the forearm moves and the shoulder does not. So would there ever be a case where that were reverse pants? Right, pull-ups. When you do a pull-up, your elbow doesn't move because you're attached to a bar with your hand, but the shoulder does move. But the shoulder is still the origin, even though in that case it's moving. So here we have the picture. Again, we have the origin, the supraglenoid tubercle, which is right up in here, and the coracoid process, which is right there. And then we have the two insertions, bicipital tuberosity right there, and the bicipital aponeurosis right there. Bicipital tuberosity can be called radial tuberosity. The aponeurosis, I think we've talked about them before, but maybe not. Aponeurosis is a broad, flat tendon. Okay. So some names for muscles based on what they do. We have prime movers or agonists. And the prime mover is a muscle that is going to produce or provide most of the force for a particular movement of that joint. A good example is the deltoid. Deltoid is a prime flexor of the arm. Iliopsoas is the prime flexor of the thigh. They create most of the power to move that joint. We have synergists. So synergists can be qualified as a synergist for one of two reasons. Either it aids the prime mover by keeping an intermediate joint stable so that it doesn't move in some undesired way, or it does the same thing as the other muscle that it's synergistic to. So the example I think we mentioned, the anconeus and the triceps brachii both extend the forearm. The anconeus is a synergist to triceps, and conversely the triceps brachii is synergistic to the anconeus. They both extend the elbow. Antagonists. Antagonists have opposite actions of each other. So if you have a flexor of a joint, its antagonist would be an extensor of the same joint. In the example I've given here, brachialis and biceps brachii both are flexors of the elbow, and there's antagonist to triceps brachii, which is an extensor of the elbow. Conversely, triceps brachii is an antagonist of brachialis and biceps brachii because it moves that joint in opposite direction. We have size. So some muscles are larger than others and some muscles are small. And here's a name that tells you, right? So extensor carpi radialis brevis is a short muscle. And extensor carpi radialis longus is a long muscle. You can tell right from the name. These are good names, by the way, because it tells you what it does. It extends, it tells you what it extends, the carpi, and it tells you where it is. It's on the radial side. Gluteus maximus is the largest of the gluteal muscles, and gluteus minimus is the smallest of the gluteal muscles. We can also name muscles based on their shape. So we have teres major. So some of you should remember from your zoological roots, teres means round. So teres major is sort of a round muscle. Serratus anterior is going to be serrated like a knife. The delta, and we'll talk about why that is the case. We're going to actually talk about serratus anterior in the lectures, part 3 of the lecture. So we'll talk about why it looks like a serrated knife. Deltoid muscle is going to be triangular, and the rhomboideus muscle is going to be shaped like a rhomboid. So these are all grand things, right? We can also name muscles by the directions of the fibers. So rectus femoris. Rectus means straight, so this is a straight muscle in the thigh. Transverse abdominis. This muscle has muscle fibers that go transversely across the abdomen. External abdominal oblique. The external abdominal oblique has oblique orientation of its muscle fibers between the ribs. Within the abdomen. You know, there is an external intercostal muscle which is actually the same muscle as external abdominal oblique. The only difference is that it has ribs kind of in the mix. So I apologize for that. External abdominal oblique is oblique and it is in the abdomen. Okay, location. Sometimes we can tell where muscles are by their name. So external intercostal tells you that it's in the between the ribs, and it is the superficial most of the 3 intercostal muscles. We have flexor digitorum profundus. Something that is profound is deep. So flexor digitorum profundus is a muscle deep to flexor digitorum superficialis. And we have biceps femoris. Biceps femoris tells you it's near the femur, okay, with 2 heads, by the way. Attachment. We just mentioned how many heads a muscle has. Sternohyoid is, this one's going to be real easy. I mean, if you just break down the name, you can kind of tell where it comes from. It comes from the sternum, goes to the hyoid bone. Sternocleidomastoid comes from the sternum, goes to the clavicle and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And this one's kind of interesting because where it originates down in the sternum and the clavicle, it kind of splits into 2. And if you were to study a cat, you would see that there are actually 2 separate muscles, a sternomastoid and a cleidomastoid. Number of attachments. Biceps femoris has 2 origins, and it's in the posterior side of the thigh. It's actually one of the hamstring muscles. Triceps brachii has 3 attachments, right? 3 origins. One is on the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and then it has 2 origins on the humerus. Action. Sometimes muscle names tell you what they do. I already pointed that out. So flexor digitorum superficialis is going to flex the digits and it's superficial. Oh, by the way, if a muscle flexes the digits, it also flexes the wrist. And if a muscle extends the digits, it also extends the wrist. Adductor longus. So adductor longus is going to adduct the thigh. It also flexes the thigh. So this gets us through part 2. We're going to stop here, and I'm going to make another Camtasia video with Pansy the Answer Dog for part 3. We'll finish the material. I'm hopeful that breaking these Camtasias into shorter segments makes it easier for you to maintain your focus and get through filling in the blanks if you missed the lecture. Okay, so good luck everybody. I hope you have a great day.